cover, so we're going to go on and get started. Are you with me? Hello? Hello? Go on and continue to eat. I want you to finish your meal. But we're going to go on and get started. But I wanted to go on and give you the opportunity. We're going to open it up for just a couple of questions before we dive into the relational game changer. So anybody have any pressing question that you would like to ask at this point? Right over here. We got one right over here. To your left. Like, where's Waldo? Right here. By the green sweater. Yeah. There he is.
I was just,
yes.
I was just wondering through these questions that we're doing, because I find myself as a pastor to our church, is I'm seeing the total difference, or a lot of difference anyway, between pre-pandemic and now. To how I would evaluate the questions that we have, because some of those questions I wrote down 2 numbers, and that's the reason why.
Yeah.
But how do you see that?
Yeah. So the situation is you're dealing with the post-pandemic church. So whatever the score is now is what you would want to score it as, because that's the way that you're having to score and move forward with whatever the situation is now. Right? So we can mourn whatever it was, or rejoice in whatever it was, depending on the differences. But you want to score it as the how you would score the current congregation. And that's what you're going to build on, is whatever strength it is now. Yeah, good question, good question. Any other questions before we move on? All right. You all are going to just say, just let me eat, and you go. Heard, and I will move on. Thank you so much. All right. So when I was asked to come and speak, what was of most important to the committee was we really want to hear about reaching new people, which is really about what? Relationship, right? So that's why we're going to spend the rest of our time this afternoon taking a deep dive into that relational game changer. And I offered 15 different kind of shifts that we're going to have to make in being the church in the endemic world, if you will. All right? So we're going to look through the relational shift through 15 different lenses. So you're welcome to kind of do a tally and give yourself like 1 score, or you're welcome to look at this and give yourself like a score in each of the different 15 areas. So I'll let you do it the way that you feel most comfortable, all right? So the first kind of shift in the relational is we're going to shift from being inside resource focused to outside resource focused. What does that mean? When I say resource, what kind of resources do you think about when it comes to the church? Money. What else? People. What else? Building. What else? Love. Love from the church. What else? Where it's located. What else? Think about curriculum that you buy. Right? What else? Staff, yes. And that could be paid staff and unpaid staff. Meaning anyone leading a ministry area, friends, we need to think of as staff. They just happen to be unpaid. But are we developing ministry leaders as though they're staff? Are we putting resources in? I mean, we oftentimes put in leadership development, professional development for clergy, but do we do that for staff, paid and unpaid staff? What are you doing for leadership development, right? Okay, So if you were to look at your budget from how much of your budget, how much of your resources in all those different ways, how much of your building is being used for, how much of your people are being used for, those for people that are already gathered versus people that are yet to be gathered. How much of your resources are being used for one versus the other, right? If you were to guess at this point, your total resources, all packaged up in all of those things and probably more that we just mentioned, what percentage of your total resources are being used for the congregation that is already gathered? What percentage would you all guess? 100% inside. How about the rest of y'all? Anybody 50-50? 60-40? 70-30? Do any of you have 20% allotted for outside focus? Any of you have an evangelism line? Oh, that's the E word again. Sorry, no warning. Evangelism focus? No? All right. So give yourself a rating, if that's what you're going to do here, on the relational shift 1, from shifting from inside focus to outside focus, resourced. Okay, shift 2 is a shift from fear or denial of relationship with neighbors to embracing neighbors with love, compassion, and empathy. So I was working with the church, and they had been the go-to. They had been a church of 500 back in the day, if you know what I mean. And they'd gone from, multiple pastor appointments to full-time to half-time. They were now down to the decision to go quarter-time. And they were down to about 60 people in worship attendance, pre-pandemic. And so I asked the question, how many of you live in this neighborhood, in the surrounding community? And what do you think the answer was? How many? Goose egg, 0. And so why do you think we didn't live in the neighborhood anymore? It had changed, right? Where did they live? They had moved out, right? So the church was mostly from a family, extended family, friends of a family, right? Pretty much. And some of the original family had lived in the neighborhood but had moved out. And it was a completely different demographic that now lived in the neighborhood. And they started making all sorts of excuses of, we tried this, we've tried that. But then they said, well, we don't have evening meetings here anymore. And they first began to make excuses like, well, people just won't come out for those. But after you dig a little bit, what they finally were willing to admit is they were scared to come to the neighborhood after dark. They no longer were willing to make and build relationships. They were no longer willing to invest in their neighborhood. Right? Because we weren't willing to be courageous. So here's the thing, friends. The church was planted in that neighborhood. It was anointed, it was planted to serve that neighborhood. And when we are unwilling and unable to be the church of that neighborhood, we need to turn it over to people that are. Being a drive-in church does not work. We don't do life there. We don't shop there. We don't dine there. We don't have relationships there. We bring our relationships in from other areas, and we celebrate those 1 hour a week on Sunday, and then we go back to our respective neighborhoods. How are we going to love on those neighbors, invest in those neighbors, build relationships with those neighbors when we don't do life there? And we're not willing to do life there. And I think we have a hard time making that tough decision because that's our church building. No, it's not your church building. It's Christ's church building. So when we are unable or unwilling, we need to be willing to turn the keys over to someone who is willing and courageous to build relationships in that neighborhood, because that neighborhood still needs Christ. And that's the anchor to do that, right? So we have to be willing to embrace our neighbors, whoever they are. Whoever they are. We need to show love and compassion and empathy. Empathy means I share the situation with you. I understand. It's not I feel sorry for, I do for, but it's with. Do you hear the difference? We do a whole lot of for ministry, but we need to do a lot more with ministry with our neighbors and invite them to be a part of, not just the church, but a part of the serving. Then they feel valued and seen and loved. So, how is your church doing in moving to embracing the neighbors, loving on the neighbors, regardless if they look like you or a reflection of your congregation? What's your number? Shift number 3 is very related to shift number 2, and this is the drive-in church. I was working with an urban situation where there were 10 churches. It was a capital city, but it was a capital, but wasn't the largest city in the state. It had about 110,000 population, and there were these 10 downtown churches. And there's all 10 United Methodists. There was far more than 10 downtown churches, but there were 10 United Methodist churches. And in those 10 churches, guess how many we had in worship? Pre-pandemic. In 10 churches. We had about just over 300. Okay? And some of them were big cathedrals. Lots of stained glass, solid marble, altars and baptismals. Some of them had $3 million endowments that were now down to $300,000 endowments that had sold off all of their downtown parking to be able to keep up the building. The slate was coming off in windstorms, so that they had to put up all the warning signs of liability that it would hit cars parked in the area. And one building, you couldn't go in the basement because it was so wet and mildewy. There was only really one salvageable building in all of them. So when you ask to say, what would something new and exciting look like? What if we came together and we were more of a reflection of this urban area? how many of those just over 300 do you think lived in that urban area? About a dozen. So were they interested? No, because they had no commitment. They had no stake. Because what had they become? All of them had become drive-in churches. The nostalgia was in the building, the location that they drove to on Sunday. It was no longer about the reach of the community. It was no longer about serving the urban core. It became about going to my building on Sunday. Is your church a reflection of the mission field? Now, let's talk about the mission field. Have you had an intentional conversation in your church about what your mission field is? The geographic surrounding area that you're being called to serve and to take responsibility for reaching. Now, so often you send in your pastor or somebody on staff, or the conference sends you a mission insight report, the demographic report, right? And there's defaults in that report. Sometimes it's a 2.5-mile radius or 3.5-mile radius, and it's always a circle. Can I assure you that not every mission field is a circle, first of all? Okay? And an urban mission field is much smaller than a suburban mission field. And a rural mission field is much larger than a suburban mission field. And it isn't always a circle. Sometimes it's a zip code, sometimes it's a school district, and sometimes it's a polygram. You can actually put pins on it to say it goes to the railroad on the east, it goes to the river on the west, it goes to this county line on the north, and then it goes along this mountain ridge on the south. Because that's kind of the natural boundary lines of how you do life in that community. It's the natural tendencies of where you shop and live and do life. So it's intentional, as opposed to you're running a report that tells you. And when you do that, the information is much more relevant to you. Too often, we're about, but, you know, the mission field is the world. We want to reach everybody. But when we do that, we run the report too large, then what happens is it waters down the information that is most relevant to us of getting to who is our neighbor. So when we really hone in on that smaller area, and usually it needs to be under 10,000 to really hone in on your neighbors, it's much more helpful, friends. So when you say, how do you move about in your neighborhood? Right? So if you live in this area, right? So where do you normally shop? And it's not from where people in this congregation live. Those are two separate conversations. Okay? So often we put our mission field as to where people live that are coming here. That is not who we're necessarily called to reach. Because a lot of times the people that come here once lived in the neighborhood, or they come here because they have family here. Okay? But we're called to take responsibility for those that are right around the church to begin with. And once you reach all of those, great, then move your lines out further. Does that make sense? Okay? It's important for us to understand who our neighbors are first and foremost, right? And if we are drive-in people, then we need to make making more of a commitment to say, how are we going to invest in our mission field intentionally? How are we going to come in and shop more there, or dine more there, or spend time with people there, so that we understand the mission field? Because how can we plan ministry to reach the people in the mission field if we don't know them, what their needs are, and what they're looking for, what keeps them up at night, what pains them? Okay? So, how are you on relational shift number 3? How are you integrating into the mission field as the church, as a whole, but individually as disciples? Write your number down. In the 1990s, my church built a family life center, as did so many others. And we were taught, build it and they will come. Right? People are looking for places to have recreation. Right? But here's what my church missed. They didn't have a strategy to put it into place. They didn't have any sort of plans. Because surely if we built the building, then the rest would take care of itself. But they put a budget together that would support the payment of the building, but they didn't have an idea of the budget for programming or for staffing to run that. And so guess what? It sat empty most of the time. And I see that in so many places across the country. Or, too many pastors have been taught, oh, well, as soon as we are out of debt, we got to have another building project because that's what brings people. Building, building, building. And so often now we have so many buildings that are outsizing congregations. We are not real estate poor in the United Methodist Church. And there we are in some of our situation now. So, that is not going to be our solution, is build it and they will come. Or, another thing we've done is say, oh, we just need to launch a new worship experience or a new kind of worship. And so we put all of this energy into creating a new worship experience, but somehow we think that just offering the worship experience, that people will somehow know about it and want to come. We didn't build relationships and do a small group experience and do invitations or bridge events so that people would want to come to it because they knew people here and would want to be a part of it. We just launched the worship experience. We didn't have a plan, right? Because we bought into this whole attractional mode. Or we want to hire, or we'll go and hire a daycare or preschool director, let them set up their own 501c3, and boom, all those children and those families that come in Monday through Friday will magically wake up on Sunday morning and go, I wonder what goes on there on Sunday morning. I think I'll go check it out. Right? Those are all attractional strategies. And again, how's that working for us? Right? So instead, we have to move into a dispatched movement. Dispatched means out of the building, right? So how are we going to be out of the building seeking opportunities to be engaged in the community and finding those ways that we can leverage ourselves as disciples of Christ to be helpful, build relationships, so that we might have the opportunity to share our faith. We were kind of maybe based in a movement to begin with, right? I don't think we were ever meant to be settlers, but we've got ourselves into a settler kind of mindset. that we've got it so figured out that we can just settle right here and people will just come to us. And that worked when culture felt they had an obligation to be in church. We're no longer in that culture. We, as Christians, are countercultural. Right? Y'all knew that? That is not news, I hope. We are countercultural. People do not wake up and go, wow, I think I'm supposed to go to church today, right? We're now on the third generation of families who have grown up in unchurched families. There are communities that are like 30% churched. So in other words, 70% unchurched. And it's not necessarily nones and dones. They're just, it's never on their mind. They were never exposed to it. I was working with another conference. It was actually a church that was just wanting to sell their building, and they were leaving such a vital mission field, and I was trying to help them think about things a little differently. I mean, they were literally across the street from an elementary school. Literally across the street from the elementary school, and I said, so what's going on over there? What are their needs? What is it? They had never, in the last 5 years, walked across the street to ask that question. Never engaged in the life of that elementary school. We had lost all hope of being in that neighborhood. All they were trying to do was figure out how to sell their building. And what were they going to do? Well, we're just going to use we're thinking 2 million, 2.2 maybe. So what can we do? We're going to go and find some strip shop, and we're going to be able to rent. And you know, we figured it out that we probably can survive like 10 years. So your vision is survival. You're going to have your own chaplain for you 12 people for 10 years. And that's good stewardship. How? There was never any vision for being the church and reaching new people. They weren't willing to walk across the street and engage in any conversation with the school to say, how could we partner? How could we be helpful? There was a brand new school that was doing all sorts of music lessons, vocal and instrumental, that had just been built next to them. They didn't know the owner. They didn't know anything about it. They had never engaged in conversation. There's a whole group of small businesses around the corner from them that were little boutique businesses. Never had any conversation with any of those business owners. All sorts of opportunity there, right? All they were thinking about is survival. But what if we'd gotten out of our building and got creative, innovative, relational, and invested in our community? What potential could have been there? So how do we get ourselves out of this scarcity mindset? I believe in a God of abundance, don't you? And if we believe that, then doesn't that really call for us to be about a movement? Doesn't that call for us to be innovative? Doesn't that call for us to be about dispatching? Doesn't that call us to engage in our community? Rather than sitting in our buildings thinking about how to survive. Amen? So, shift 4 of relationships. How are you doing at becoming a dispatched movement? Rather than waiting for people to show up. What's your number? Write it down. All right, shift 5 in relational. How many of you have ever been in a program-driven church? Like, it was just program after program after. It's draining, isn't it? Yeah. Now, sometimes program-driven becomes staff-driven, right? Which then there's a whole laity component that is attached to that too. That isn't always healthy. And so that means our staff then are they equippers, or are they the ones that are the doers? Right? And so I hope that if we're doing staffing that are driving, that they are actually equippers. They identify, equip, and they deploy, as opposed to being the doers. So if you want to grow a program, like for instance, if you want a great children's program, I hope you don't say, oh, we got to get a great children's director. That's not the answer, right? If you are going to hire a children's director, then one of the primary questions that you need to ask a children's director in this scenario is, tell me how you build teams. Tell me how you identify, recruit, and equip. Tell me about a time when, right? Oh gosh, if we think about youth directors, that always felt like a revolving door. I can't tell you the number of youth directors that my son had in our church. And it was always so painful because those kids would get so attached because that youth director was everything in that program because there was not a team around him, right? And so when we lost a director, what happened? The program fell apart. And then it took forever to get somebody else in there, and then the program had to be completely rebuilt. So you lost 6 months, sometimes more, right? Instead of, how did that youth director have a team that sustained, and there was consistency, right? So the same is true around programs, that programs should be driven from what helps us with our mission and our vision and our goals for the year, as opposed to the program that we've done forever. Or, I love this one, like, you see that church down the road? You know, everybody's going down there, so let's go check out what they're doing. Or I've heard that they're doing this program. We need to be doing that program too. Because if that's what everybody likes, then that's surely what we need to do so that we get those people too. But again, their context may be different. They're probably reaching a different niche than maybe you're trying to reach, a different demographic. The gifts of your church and the passions of your church are probably different to pull off that ministry. You do copycat a whole lot, right? Instead of what's the best for us based on where God's calling our church specifically for the vision that we have discerned God calling us to, and the demographic that we have discerned God calling us to reach. Do you hear the difference? Right? So that's a part of when we're thinking about the programming side. But the other piece is, rather than saying, we're going to launch this great new program that we're going to have people engage in, what does it look like for us then to go out and do life in the community relationally that organically blossoms ministry? Because it's things that people are interested in doing, both churched and, listen to this, unchurched. What a novel idea, right? And sometimes instead of creating something, we come alongside something that's already existing. We plant ourselves in movements in the community and come alongside. We don't have to create it. So often we have food pantries, and sometimes we end up with too many because that's sometimes easier to do than some of the harder relational work. But what is the thing that we can do? Come alongside, or there's a gap that needs to be filled because we are out there doing life with the community instead of walling ourselves off from the community, right? That means we have to be out and about. Okay, think about this. Just in your mind, the top 5 people outside your family that you spend time with. Okay, got them in your mind? Are they church people? How many of your top 5 people are church people? Raise your hand. It ends up happening to us, doesn't it? We end up spending time mostly with our church people. So what if you just made a commitment to one person? I'm going to make one of my top 5 an unchurched person. And then you move into 2. And then maybe half of your time you start spending with unchurched. Okay, I know that's uncomfortable. But in order to reach new people, friends, that's what we're going to end up having to do. Right? This is the discomfort of being a disciple. Do you remember when Jesus said, leave everything behind and follow me? He kind of meant it. We've gotten really comfortable at being followers, haven't we? I think we've gotten to the point of, thinking that we should just be really comfy sitting on the pew waiting for people to show up doing the things that we like to do and just follow along, right? But it's part of becoming a dispatched movement, but it's doing life with those that are unchurched. What's your number when you think about doing life together with the unchurched? Maybe it's taking up a new hobby. Write your number down. All right, we're going to do shift 6 at this point. I can only tell you the story because I know we're live on Facebook, only because my mother got locked out of Facebook. I can tell you the story. Okay? So I'm going to tell you my mom's story when it comes to judgmental, because I know none of your moms are judgmental. So I'm number 3 of 4 children, okay, raised in the church. And my mom and I go to the same, I'm the only child that lives local, so you know what that means, right? And I'm with you, brother. So my son was a teenager at this time, and we have this weather pattern this winter that every Thursday it's been snowing. Well, in this particular year, it was every Sunday, like 4 Sundays in a row it had snowed. But we didn't have those thawing times like we normally do, and so it was an accumulation. And so it was like the 4th Sunday in a row, and we had like 14 inches of snow, which is unusual in the Kansas City area where I live. And so, again, a teenager, and I got him to church. That in itself, I thought was an accomplishment, right? And so, walk into church, and I saw my mother sitting on the pew. And being the good daughter that I am, I was going to go and take my family to sit by my mother, right? I thought that was another win. Well, again, it was the contemporary service, and I had on jeans and a sweater, as did my family, boots, right? So I come up the side aisle. My mother was already sitting, and as I got to the aisle, or to the pew, and I turned to go into the pew, and my mother noticed, and do you know what I got? The look. You've seen the look, right? The look. Did my mother ever say a word? Didn't have to, right? Because the look told me everything she had to say, right? And I'm sure she didn't judge my husband or my son because she didn't raise them. But she raised me to know better, right? You don't come to church that way. I taught you better. You know, it was all a reflection of her in her mind, right? How dare you show up that way? Now, here's the sad part. What if I had been a first-time guest? Because I think my mother would have given them the stink eye too. Because my mother will be 85 in April. Now, she's had one knee replaced twice. At that time, it had only been replaced once, and the other knee replaced once. And again, I told you the weather conditions, right? And it was still snowing that day. But she still had on her dress and stockings and heels in those weather. Because that's the way you're supposed to come to church. So anyone that didn't match her expectations would have gotten the Shirley stink eye. Right? Right? And those were her expectations, not the expectations of the congregation, but it was the Shirley expectations. So, okay, I know my mom and whatever, right? But my heart broke to think, what if I had been a first-time guest? Or, y'all know safe seats in worship. Now, sometimes they just know safe seats, but I've been in churches where there have been like cushions, Afghans, stuffed bears, that save seats. Or tissue boxes. I mean, it's been amazing the things that people put in pews to save seats. And of course, guests have been asked to move. Right? Or piercings or tattoos or body odor or, I mean, we could go on and on, right? And that's just appearance. So what if someone is uncomfortable being touched? And that's a growing concern, folks, in our post-COVID days. And so when we're all up in people's business around our meet and greet, we can judge people to say they're not friendly when they could have a condition or they're still fearful of COVID. But we've judged them based on our culture and our expectations, right? But how do we become a judge-free zone? How do we just love on people for who they are? That they're there, that they're showing up, or when we meet them in the community. Because this is one of the top 3 that people don't want to be a part of a church because they think we're judgmental. Hypocritical would be the other one. Judgmental and hypocritical are the ones that we are most known for. Right? So, how is your church in being open, truly open and non-judgmental? Write down your number. All right, our next is relational shift 7. I was working with a church that was a historically black church, but interestingly enough, it was a white church that said we want to merge with a black church, and then the white church left and left the black church with a broken down building and no money. The African American church then was in an African American neighborhood, which was a great match, right? But this huge, and it was on the historical registry. But the ironic part of this, though, was that there was a green project that was going on in the city, that they couldn't finish the project because some of the equipment that they needed to bring in caused some vibration, and they were afraid that the bell tower that was strapped in, seriously, it had straps, would come down if they brought in that piece of equipment. That's the kind of condition this church was in. So when I asked the church in a consultation, I said, so are you a reflection of your neighborhood? And they said, well, of course. And I said, you truly are. And they said, well, of course. We're African American and we're in an African American neighborhood. And I said, but there's other kinds of ways of being a reflection, right? I saw the cars in the parking lot at the church. They don't reflect the same kind of cars in the neighborhood. Like, I see Lexus and Cadillacs and Range Rovers and such in the parking lot of the church. And I see 20-year-old kind of cars in driveways around here. Socioeconomically, do you reflect? And their mouths dropped open. They had never thought about that. So people came to their soup kitchen, but they wondered why there was such a disconnect with the neighborhood. Because guess what? They were driving in from the suburbs in their fancy cars from their fancy houses to serve, not do ministry with. Right? So sometimes even our understanding of reflection, we get stuck kind of in one layer. So when we think about the church, think about your church specifically, is how monocultural are you? Socioeconomically, racially, life stage, age, ethnically, and are we a reflection of our community? We have a generation of our millennials and now our Gen Z who are interested in all sorts of multicultural, multi-socioeconomically, multi-generational. But here's the thing, friends, is we sometimes say, well, we want to mentor them, but they want to also mentor us. So it's a both and. So there's opportunity there, but the way we go about it, we have to think about it as a two-way instead of a one-way street. So how multi are we? And then, are we a reflection of our community? The other thing is we can't force diversity that isn't in our community, right? But we need to be open to it in all the ways that it is present, if that makes sense. Okay? So, relationally, how multicultural and multi-generational is your church? Write your number down. All right, our 8th shift relationally is moving from pastor expected. You also might call it pastor centered. Sometimes it's personality centered. So what does that look like? What are some of the things that you have encountered? Maybe some of you have never had this in your church, but maybe you've heard stories. If you have a pastor-centered, pastor-expected kind of leadership, it's called Autocratic Leadership also in the church. What kind of things go on? How is it led? What's your experience?
Nothing goes on unless the pastor buys into it.
Okay, nothing goes on unless the pastor buys into it. What else? Okay, nothing goes on unless the pastor does it. Pastor has a finger in every pot. Sometimes I call it the spoke and hub. Kind of like the pastor is the hub, and everything goes in or out through the pastor, right? What else? Pastor is the first
filter of new ideas.
The pastor is the first filter of new ideas. Okay? And one in the back. Okay. She's saying that they have had pastors that have wanted to be pastor-centric, that it has not worked in their church. Most of the things come from the congregation or from ministry teams. Correct? Okay. Okay. What other things do you contribute to pastor-centered, personality-driven? Is it vital, effective? What's your experience? Okay. His experience is most of the time they're micromanaged. And the pastor burns out because it's not sustainable. My editorial is not sustainable. Yeah? Right, so it's not consistent. So if you have a pastor that kind of has that leadership style, and then they leave, and then you have one that comes in, then you're all discombobulated because you have gotten used to that leadership style. Yep, yep, very true, very true. And sometimes we have some really great growth, and then when they leave, because the relationships were built with the pastor only, right, then you have probably some fallout. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I'm having trouble rating any of these things because I know how our smaller group is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're the ones that are really going forward.
Yep.
And I'm having trouble even looking back. I'm thinking I'm feeling weighted down.
Yeah.
Like that. And I look at some, I don't know if that has all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what his question was too. It's like, am I rating before? Am I rating current? Because I think if we're rating towards what it was, and based on the people that were there then we're building on something that isn't existing anymore. So we have to look at the people that are engaged and are going to take us forward, right? And it may look completely different. It probably does look very different than what it was before. Okay, there. So, and like I said, a lot of what's happened is those that were, I'm not that into you, that we had to twist their arm to get them to say the yes, are gone. So what's left many churches are finding that what's left are the highly committed. It may be smaller, but overall, it's a higher committed group of people, if that makes sense. Are y'all finding that as well? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so when we move to disciple responsible, right? Then when you have the changes in leadership, you don't feel it so much, is because the consistency of your local leadership is there, right? Now, I wrote a blog recently about this, and I said, we are not going to point any fingers. We're not going to do any blaming of what got us to that place. In a denomination that tends to be more that way, or in a local church. That's not going to be helpful, okay? Let's just not go there. But what we can do is say, we know that is not necessarily the highest and most effective way for churches to lead. And so, how can we move into more of a disciple responsible? Because again, this is going back to our roots. What happened in the circuit rider days? Did we have a pastor there every week? We didn't. Right? We didn't have a preacher every week to preach. Was the preacher there for all the meetings during the week? No. He showed up to preach. And amen to that, preachers, right? Right? Not to have all those meetings. The church was led by the congregation, by the disciples. And I think that's what it was meant to be. Again, I was auditing another board meeting a couple of Sundays ago, and I was astonished. The pastor led the board meeting. And so I provide feedback at the end, and the chair's name was Janet. And I said, Janet, who prepared this agenda? The pastor. I said, Janet, this is your meeting. You're the chair of the board. You prepared the agenda in coordination with the pastor, but you lead the meeting. I do? You do. You do. Yeah. Yeah. And again, there's all reasons on both sides why this has happened. But the thing is, we have to become equippers and make the disciples, once again, responsible for leading the church, right? For leading the church. So, how are you holding disciples responsible for building relationships and leading the church? What does that look like? What's your score? Moving past pastor expected or pastor centered? All right, shift 9, moving from church-centric to community-centric. So when you say, I'm going to church, what's the first thing that, like the picture in your mind? What came to mind when I said, you're going to church? The building. Anybody else? People? In a building. Do you remember what we taught children in, right? Oh, you have to open the door to see the people, right? Because the people are all in the building. They're all in the church, right? Right? And so what if we teach people, I mean, we know it intellectually, but so much of our language and so much of our planning is about, when we talk about the church, it's so much about the facility. I'm going to church means I'm going to the building. And so as we think about it, and even when we say, oh, well, we're going to have a meeting, so often the meeting, oh, well, what room is it in the church that we're going to do? When we're doing small groups, so often we think about meeting at the building. It's our go-to as opposed to whose home is going to host that. It's our default. And when we are in a postmodern world, where up to 70% of our mission fields are unchurched, nuns, duns, and have never been exposed to church, meeting in the community, gathering in the community, is going to be much more comfortable than in the church. So how do we become, again, community-centric as opposed to building-centric? When was the last time you had your church council meeting or board meeting in public? In a restaurant? Did I hear it never? Yeah. When's the last time you had your Bible study out in the community? Again, we just think of default because we do church things in the church building as opposed to taking the church to the community, right? Or on Sunday, we don't do worship. Instead, we go into the community and serve the community during the worship hour. I know, the gasp, right? But what if every time we think about being the church, doing the church, about the church, that we always think about it in the context of the community? Because, friends, we are to be the heartbeat of the community. How are we weaving ourselves into the tapestry of the community? So often we become isolated because we become church-centric instead of community-centric. How do we stop ourselves from doing that? So every time we think building, every time we think church, think about community instead, community. Even start using that different language and thinking about building and meeting in different ways, different places, becoming part of the community, inviting the community in, inserting ourselves, being in the community more. So, how are you being more community-centric than church-centric? Write your number down. All right, we're on shift 10 within relationships. How do we shift from curriculum-driven to intentional discipleship pathway? Right. How many of you have a discipleship pathway in your church? Discipleship pathway. Okay? All right, so if someone, here's the question. So if you have a new believer, a new Christian, that comes into your church, how do they go from a seeker, new believer, to a fully committed follower of Jesus Christ? So in 6 weeks we do that. And when we graduate, poof, our little button like a Thanksgiving turkey just comes out and we're done. Well, I hope that is true.
It is. You will come visit.
And most children graduate, not in your church, I'm not saying, but most children, when they graduate from confirmation, they graduate from church. Too often. Because then we don't have anything else for them. So, whether they're a child, whether an adult, how do we help them? All right, I'm going to show my age once again. How many of you ever go to McDonald's? McDonald's. We have a fan. Okay? How many of you have ever eaten a Big Mac? Okay? All right? Do you know how to make a Big Mac? How do you know? Okay, to go with me, 2 all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. How do we know that? Right? We're all going to show our age because there was a commercial, there was a jingle, right? Right? And we heard it. Now, I was a girl that worked at the Dairy Queen, so I could still do the twirl, right? I never worked at Dairy Queen, nor have I ever eaten a Big Mac. But if I ever worked at McDonald's and went back there, I bet I could figure out how to make a Big Mac because I could sing it in my head and figure it out, right? If you go to any McDonald's and order a Big Mac, you're going to get that same Big Mac because they are known for their Big Mac and they teach all of their people to make a Big Mac. Now, French fries at McDonald's are a different thing. I've had a French fry or 2 at McDonald's. And you can expect the same French fry, right? Because they have standard recipes. And you're going to get that same experience at any McDonald's. Well, at least in the U.S., I understand. Abroad, they have different menus. Okay? Because that's what they do. They know what they're supposed to do, and they train their people to do it. What business are we in? Disciple making. But yet, we don't have an intentional process to help people in their faith. What's your discipleship pathway? In your sermon, how are you directing them to engage in the discipleship pathway and take their next faithful step? How are you connecting with their message as it is as a disciple and that is a maturation of their discipleship pathway? How are you helping them with their membership vow being part of discipleship? How are you helping with service being part of their discipleship? Of leadership being part of discipleship? That all that you do is helping them with their discipleship pathway, of maturing as a disciple. And that we are never, ever finished. That's part of our problem, friends, is we haven't done a good job of developing disciples because we've been curriculum-driven instead. And the other thing that has been a result of this is we've had too many people that say, I've done my time. It's somebody else's turn. Because they never understood we're never finished serving and being a disciple. Because we have taught people that discipleship is taking care of your building, putting your butt in the plate, and put your buck in the plate. Putting your buck in the plate, taking care of your building, and showing up for worship. That's it. Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Get the lifetime sentence on trustees, too. I'm sorry. I forgot that part. Right? That's what we told them discipleship was. We didn't use those words, but that's what we told them. That's what you're supposed to do. Right? And we have Sunday school, great committed Sunday school teachers, but we didn't give them any direction of what it looks like to help people mature intentionally on their discipleship pathway. We just left it up to them to try to figure it out. We didn't equip them because we didn't understand what it was to help people intentionally develop as a disciple. I mean, even if all we were doing is helping people in those 5 areas of their vows, that'd be a really great start. But what it looked like for prayer as a seeker, to a beginner, to an intermediate, to a fully formed follower, that looks different at all of those levels. And then look at that from a worship standpoint, look at that from a serve standpoint, right? And then to help people connect all the pieces of the life of the congregation, the life of the faith community to the discipleship pathway, and helping them take their next faithful step. Do you hear the intentionality of that? And then we become disciple makers. Did you hear that other piece of the commitment to worship, building, attendance plate, serving on a committee? It had nothing to do with discipleship, let alone being a disciple maker. So no wonder we're having trouble with churches growing, because we never had the expectation of becoming disciple makers, let alone disciples, fully formed disciples, right? So, friends, how are you doing with intentional discipleships? Pathways, even growing intentionally in disciples. What's your number? What's the time? We're in trouble. Yeah. We're going till 3 or 2. All right, I think your pasta from lunch has kicked in a little bit, and so we're getting the afternoon sleepy. So I'm going to give you a few minutes break, and then we're going to come back and finish up the 5 shifts in relationship and finish up some other work. Okay? So take about. I'm going to tell you a 7-minute break, because I know you're not going to be back in 7 minutes, but a 7-minute break. Okay? If you'll be finding your seats, please. If you'll find your seats, please. Take your seats, please. Thank you. Well, that was helpful. The energy level in the room went up quite a bit, so good. All right, we are at shift number 11 in a relational game changer. And this one moves us from self-guided to intentional relational connections. Here's what this means. Is often we have someone as a first-time guest, whether it's in worship or they connect in other ways. And that could even be online. And oftentimes they have to figure it out for themselves, right? Now, and I don't know, some of you may not realize that at this point, but you probably have figured it out by the way I talk. Not that I'm a Midwesterner, that's not what I meant, but that I'm a layperson, okay? So if I go back to, I was a banker in my earlier days, and we called it cross-selling, okay? When someone had one banking relationship with us, we were always looking for cross-selling into multiple banking relationships with us. Here's what I mean by that. So if someone had a checking account with us and they had some sort of bad experience with the bank, it was much easier for them to leave with only one relationship attachment to the bank. But if they had a checking account and a safe deposit box and a credit card and a car loan, it was much more difficult to change your banking relationship, right? Much more complex. So the situation to get you to leave had to be far worse than if you only had one account, right? Now, I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but there's some translation when it comes to the life of the church. If someone is only a part of worship and they have no other connections into the faith community, and the way that they were worshiping changes, it's much easier for them to not be into you so much anymore. But if they were part of your worshiping community and they had a relationship in a small group and they were serving in some sort of ministry area that they were really passionate about, they probably had much deeper roots that kept them attached to the faith community than if they were only in worship, right? Okay. So when someone comes in, whatever door that they come into the faith community, oftentimes they may get a really great, friendly greeting, right? They get that at your church, right? Please tell me yes. Even if you have to lie to me at this point. They really get a great greeting, okay? But do we help them get connected? That's a difference. There's hospitality, which is different than connection. Those are two different levels. Hospitality is about first impressions. So there is great hospitality here today. It was about getting you into the building, like finding the right places, getting into the right door, registering you, having great food, finding your way around the building and such, right? That's hospitality. Now, people's expectations of hospitality have been greatly raised over the years, just so you all know. And sometimes we as a church think we're doing really great with hospitality, and you are, but we're meeting expectations. Are we offering over-the-top opportunities, like exceeding expectations, right? But then there's another piece of this, that are we helping them getting connected? And please don't tell me getting them connected to a committee or to serving on a committee, right? We need to get them connected relationally. And so often when we have a new attender packet or a guest packet, what do? We give them a menu. It's like, okay, here you go, pick something. It's like we're offering a buffet. But what we need to be doing is offering them a relationship. So rather than saying, here's our worship, here's our ministry opportunities, find your way through. If we do that at all, how are we offering someone to help them connect relationally? To say, you know what, it was great to meet you today. I'd love to have coffee and hear more about your story. Can I take you to lunch, or can I meet you Friday for coffee? Whatever the case may be. Do you hear the difference? To say, here's a brochure, show up for whatever you want. You don't say it that way, but that's our gesture, right? As opposed to, it's great to meet you. I want to take the next step. And then if you, through their story, you hear that, oh my gosh, they love to play music, and they want to be a drummer. And so you help them get connected into the band, and you hand them off to the band director, whatever the case may be, right? And then they show up at the band and it didn't click. But if we don't have an intentional connection process and the band director doesn't let you know that they didn't come back the second time, then guess what? They just slipped through the cracks. They're going to go, well, it didn't fit. And they're going to feel like, well, what I needed isn't there. When there could very well be another place. But because the band director didn't let the connector know, so that the connector could engage again relationally and help him find another place, we lost him. Because we didn't have an intentional connection process. But there's also a reconnection process that we need. And this was terribly important during our pandemic. How are we keeping up with the folks and reconnecting with folks that aren't showing up? And what's our time frame that we're going to invest? There's a limited time frame that we invest. But if someone doesn't show up for how many Sundays, what's our reconnection process, and who does it? And what does it look like? If they don't show up for 3 weeks, what happens? If they don't show up for 6 weeks, what happens? If they don't show up for 2 months, what happens? And then what's your time limit of that reconnection process before the process ends? The same with new. If they come one time, what happens? If they come again, what happens? If they don't come again, what happens? Right? And it is not pastor-driven. It's disciple-driven. Go back to the previous. Right? So it's one thing for us to have that hospitality, but once that hospitality occurs, then the hospitality then hands it off to a connector. And you may, depending on the size of your church, you may only need one connector. Some of you in larger churches may need 2 or 3. Right? But who's your Patty? Right? Y'all have a Patty friend. Patty in your church. My Patty friend, so she was part of my husband's business. So she was one of my husband's customers, but we would go on these trips together, and we would get on an elevator, and we would, all different parts of the world, and I would say that any elevator we got on, if there was someone that Patty didn't know, She would know their story between floors 1 and 5. And they did not even know that they had told the story. And even better yet, Patty would remember them if they were on the next trip with us in detail. Names, dates, children, grandchildren, where they lived. Right? Those are your connector people. And too often, we put them as hospitality when they're your relationship people, right? They're your connector people. They're the ones that are going to show them around the building, because they're going to have these natural conversations and know all sorts of things about them by the end of the experience, by the end of Sunday. They're going to get invited to sit with them, and it's not going to be that awkward moment in worship to say, fill out your connector card. Patty's going to be able to fill it out for them and know all about it, right? And they're going to be asking Patty to have coffee with her. It's gifts, matching gifts with ministry opportunities, right? So tell me, how intentionally relational connection process do you have? Or do you just have people that have to figure it out and find those connections on their own? What does that look like for you? What's your score? All right, we're going to move on to shift 12. This next one is moving from building-driven ministry to relationally driven ministries. I think you all have kind of got the gist of these whole shifts. So what would the shift from building-driven to relationally driven look like in your context? Give me some examples. We're going to test it. Yeah.
I work in a church as well as go to attend, but one of the things that I just enjoyed the most in the church I worked was when we were starting to come back from the pandemic, we went outside first at the farmers market, which was just two parking lots down from us. But I just loved that atmosphere, and I just loved that openness, and it wasn't in the building, but it was close.
Okay, so we took church out to the farmer's market. Okay, great example. Yeah.
Inviting people to your home. When I joined the church, we were starting a women's Bible study.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, why don't we invite everybody to meeting at my house? That way, we can invite other people.
Yep.
Because I come from a community where you invite everybody outside. I invite a bunch of the people. There's only church ladies that showed up that time.
Yeah.
But that's how you get it, because
Right.
your home is usually a safe zone.
Yep.
Versus the building.
Yep, absolutely. So people are much more willing to come to someone's home than a church usually, especially if they're had a bad experience or they're not familiar with the church. So her idea was to gather as a Bible study group in a home instead of the church. And yours?
My thought was get out, when God says it, get off your butt.
And there you go. Should we just be done? Just do the mic drop and be done. So another church I was working with, they were doing the kind of the scattered model, and they were doing neighborhood models. So everyone was encouraged to do a block party, not in their homes, but in the street, and just invite their neighbors, right? Just start there, whether it was a game night or gather and do s'mores, whatever the case may be. What did your neighborhood network look like? And it evolved into whatever it might be, and all of those would look different, right? How about some other ideas? What would a relationally driven instead of building driven look like? Yeah.
I really like what you said about once in a while taking the time off from church and going and doing the service project.
Yep. Serve on Sunday instead of doing worship. Some churches have even done the T-shirts. The church has left the building. They wear those when they go out and serve. Yep. They do those on Fifth Sunday sometimes. Every Fifth Sunday they do that. Yeah. Yeah.
Something called Wednesday Without Walls. We used to have a fellowship meeting that was just serving our congregation.
Yeah.
So now we just move out into the parking lot. We provide free food, entertainment. It's kind of loud. Invite people who are just walking down the street.
Yeah. Awesome. So Wednesday Without Walls, they used to have their own fellowship dinner, and so they've taken it to the parking lot and invite neighbors to join them. And sometimes, do you hear that? We've leveraged ministry in a different way. So sometimes it isn't doing something new, but it's recreating or thinking about something you're already doing in a new way to invite the community or execute it in a different way that is more outwardly focused, community-centered. Yeah.
Coordinated. Each year they pick a different area of ministry, might be adoption or women's health or something, and they would do it like a walk, like a 5K or something. So that was advertised, and people from all over came, sponsored, and then it was a huge community outreach for.
So they sponsored a nonprofit cause, a different one every year, that was a fundraiser for that particular cause.
Yes, maybe like a
Yeah.
1 walk or 5K.
A 5K or something like that, yeah. Okay, yeah.
Our church the last couple of years, not just our church, but different churches in the community during our fall festival, we set up different churches and then in different areas in the town, the churches set up and do different things for the community during the fall festival. So it's like different churches may sponsor the bouncy houses or whatever, but it's different churches in the community working together during our fall festival. This particular year, the Sunday was devoted for worship, inviting our whole community. So we had all different types of denominations participating. It was sponsored by local churches. So we've actually stepped out the last several years in our community.
Great, great, yeah. Right, so yeah.
Our church has a talented lady who does knitting, crosses, knitting and crocheting. Organized a craft group. Within 24 hours, she had 20 that responded to this group coming into our church, meeting at our church.
And they did what with? So they, oh, okay, okay. So she was sharing the teaching. Okay, great, great. So she was teaching the community. Awesome. All right. And sometimes it is thinking about our marketplace differently. We compartmentalize our workplace and church completely separate. But it was never intended to be that way, and I know some of you are going to say, but separation of church and state, it doesn't mean we're hitting people over the head with the Bible, but we can build relationships, and we can lead in ways with Christian values that make people curious because we show up differently. And so we've created a movement in the United Methodist Church called Marketplace Multipliers, and starting hubs to get those started. And so if that's something that you're interested in, Kevin has a resource back there too called Marketplace Multipliers. I think that's a dispatched movement that we need to regain as laity as well, to resource and equip and become those kind of leaders out in the marketplace. So that's another kind of relationally driven. It's where you're spending the majority, lay people are spending the majority of their time anyway, right? And so how are we intentionally building relationships so that someday we might be able to share our faith? So how are you being relationally driven in ministry as opposed to building driven in ministry? What's your score? All right, we're on lucky 13 now. Okay, moving from Sunday perfect, right? We went through a phase early in the early 2000s especially where we had to have this kind of performance kind of thing where everything had to be just perfect. And really what our younger generations are looking for is something that's really authentic, organic. I was serving on a committee and the evangelism committee, and they were saying, you know, we really want to kind of move in this different, it was a national organization, and they said, we really want to do our granting a little differently. And so there was all different kind of mix of people there. And one young man hadn't really said much at all, and finally he just said, come on, we just need to have some more R&R. And an elderly scholar spoke up and said, what does rest and relaxation have to do with this? And the young man said, no, that's not what I meant. He said, raw and real. We just got to be raw and real. That's what people are looking for. We don't need to do our Sunday's best. Just show up to who you are. Be authentic. Because people think that they have to have it all together before they can show up at church. Like, who's there already has it all together? I don't know. I know I don't have it all together, but...
Well, once I stop bleeding, I'll go to the ER.
Right, exactly. And so, to have things perfect or to have things show like the big lights and all of that, that's not what our younger folks are looking for, the ones that, by and large, are missing from the church. They're looking for people to be vulnerable and just to show up and say, I don't have it all figured out, to tell the stories of where they have failed, and to say, but I'm going to help you figure it out as I figure it out too. And vulnerability, transparency are all very important to those that we're having trouble reaching. And so to some degree, it's really different than the way that we've been raised to believe, you know, our Sunday best, right, as my mother taught me, as opposed to show up to be who you are as you are, accepted. And that's what people are looking for, especially our younger generations. Because then they feel like there might be a place for them, because otherwise they don't feel that they have it together enough to show up, or that they can trust, because trust is a big deal. Because right now we're untrustworthy, because we're hypocritical and judgmental in their opinion. Right? So, are we okay to show up without having our stuff together? Are we okay to be vulnerable and say we don't, and to share the stories? Right? Because that's what people are looking for. So what's your score in being authentic, raw, real, honest, and vulnerable in your church? Write it down. All right, we're ready for 14. We're almost there. We're almost there. All right. Shifting from top-down mentoring to discipling. Here's what I mean by that. That it is not a true Bible study unless it's the pastor and preferably an ordained elder that's teaching Bible study. And in some conferences, probably not here, that it has to be from a particular seminary. And there are even some Board of Ordained Ministries that there are key words that come from particular seminaries that are the key to your ordination, because that's the preferred seminary for that boom committee at that time, right? So there is a culture in some churches, and this is larger churches, that if you want to be truly discipled and truly get the right information, then you attend the Bible study of the senior pastor, right? Otherwise, you don't attend a Bible study. The rest is just watered down, or you're not going to get the right information, because they've been led to believe that over the years. Because we haven't raised people up, first of all, we haven't equipped, and we haven't built a culture of understanding that disciples disciple others. Right? How do we come alongside? How do we show in our discipleship pathway that disciples then become disciple makers? How are we equipping leaders to become small group leaders? Do we have pastors and licensed local pastors and deacons and certified lay ministers and certified lay servants that come in and they start a small group and they identify the leader, equip them, and then they exit and then go start another small group? Or do they stay there forever because they're the only one that can lead? And so we build that culture. But all can disciple and lead. What kind of culture are we building in our church, or have we built? And can we begin to shift if we haven't built a culture that all can disciple and lead if they're equipped to do so? What does that look like in your church? What have we come to believe, accurately or inaccurately, right? So how can we begin to think about a culture of coming alongside and two-way mentoring and discipling? Remember I talked about that younger generation of, I think we can come to understand and learn from our younger just as much as we can pour into our younger disciples. That we don't have it all figured out, and we can learn from them just as much, especially when it comes to cultural competency. So, what does that look like in your church? What is your score when it comes to alongside two-way mentoring and discipling? Write your score down. All right, the last shift in relational has to do with moving from insular relationships to culturally competent and curious. So often we have insulated ourselves from understanding other generations, other ethnicities, understanding other socioeconomics. And for us to reach them in our neighborhoods, we have to understand. So often we talk about IQ, but now we have to talk about EQ, right? Our cultural competence. And in order to become more culturally competent, we have to put ourselves out there. Part of it is intellectual learning, but part of it, friends, is just going out with an open heart and just being curious and showing up with people and asking questions in a non-judgmental way, just to say, I just want to get to know you. I want to learn. Tell me your story. And so once, especially if you travel the idea of we want to choose a targeted demographic, and we choose to reach this targeted demographic, then we're going to need to have some conversations. And we're just going to show up, and we call them one-on-ones. And just start investing one-on-one relationships with the folks you're trying to reach, and just say, tell me about your story. What do you love to do? What are the things that you're afraid of? What keeps you up at night? What are your hopes and dreams? And you invest in those kind of conversations over and over and over again, and you become more culturally competent because you're exposed to more people and more conversations, and you see insights into people that you don't when all you do is surround ourselves with the same kind of people that you are, that I am, right? It comes through those relationships and exposing ourselves more, right? Because so often we have kept ourselves in a little bubble, in our monocultural bubble. And so often our United Methodist Church has done so well with middle-class white people. And our world is not primarily that, and is moving quickly away from that. And so if we're going to become the church of today and tomorrow and of the future, we have to become more culturally competent. So, what's your score when you think about becoming more culturally competent by becoming curious? All right, friends, you have a lot of scores, don't you? Right? Now, at the back of your Being the Church in the Post-Pandemic World book, there is a recap of the 8 game changers. And what you'll want to do is write your score for each of those areas. What you're looking for is, what is your area of strength? And build on your area of strength. Let's not start in the area that we're struggling with the most. What is your area of strength in the game changer? And start from there. Maybe 1 or 2 areas. build on that, and then start on the next one. Okay? The other thing that I would encourage you to do is go back to your church and expand this conversation with a team. You'll see that there are questions at the end of every chapter. That's to help you dig deeper into this conversation as a team and gain the perspective of a larger group of people and do that assessment together. And then spend time processing those questions, because it uncovers a lot more about other people's thoughts and insights as it relates to each particular game changer. Okay? Then, after you finish the small group, back at your church, because it's really hard to go back and get traction as one person or a couple of people, right? It takes more people to actually make a change in your church. Because if all we did is invested some time here today and it doesn't have an impact in your church, okay, so you got some CEUs, great. But wouldn't it be better if there was kingdom impact because of your investment in time today here? Amen? So, gather the group, work through it, do the assessment on each one, and then do the summary in the back, and then decide where is our call to action based on our strength. And then put an action plan together to say, where can we build on our strengths and become even more courageous or even more flexible, or whatever the case may be. Now, in the back of that same book, there's a bonus section, and it's called the Ultimate Relaunch Playbook. Remember we talked about it this morning, that this fall is a perfect opportunity to relaunch your church. That same small group, you can pull together. You have plenty of time to plan a relaunch for your church. And when I say playbook, it is a playbook. Step-by-step process on how to plan a relaunch. You are reintroducing your church to the community. Let them know you're there. Let them know you care about the community. But it's going to cause probably some hard conversations to be had. Maybe some budgetary conversations, some investment in some new things, which may mean you have to stop some things to be able to give you the resources of time and energy, which are the most precious resources more than money anymore, to be able to do a relaunch. Because remember, we talked about there is an opportunity here. This pandemic has given us an opportunity. But that window of opportunity is not going to be here forever. As everyone settles back into whatever this new norm is going to look like. So I'm just challenging you to take the challenge of taking advantage of this time and relaunch your church into your community. Let them know that you are there and you care, and invest in the community in a new way. And that Ultimate Relaunch Playbook in the back of your book will give you a step-by-step, play-by-play on exactly how to do that. But you cannot do it by yourself. You're going to need to wrap a team around you in order to pull that off. Okay? Any of you that might be interested in taking a deeper dive, I do cohorts around this experience as well. My email address is up here. If you're interested in that, just email me and we can talk about that further. Right? I did want to also tell you it's a different district, but I'll be back in July into the Holston Conference. And we're going to be talking about simplified accountable structure. So if some of you want to read ahead and get ready for that, Mission Possible is the book for that, and I know Kevin has some of those back there as well. I think there's 3 districts that are hosting that, but I understand they're maybe opening that to others as well. So Simplified Accountable Structure, which some refer to it as single board model. We don't intentionally call that anymore for purposes that we'll talk about at the workshop. But Mission Possible is the book that goes along with that. Some of you might have had that before. We're in our 3rd edition. It's now a big brick book that is very different. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to come and serve you once again. My prayer, my hope for you is that this was not only just a learning experience, but this will truly be taken back to your churches, and that it will have not only impact for your church, but it will have an impact for those community members in your neighborhood, in your mission field, but ultimately it will have a kingdom impact. Thank you all. Appreciate you being here.
So what do we do to prepare?
Nothing. Nothing. Nope.
Okay.
I want to thank you all. Thank you so much. We're here because we love Jesus first and foremost. We love our churches, we love our communities, we love our Kotan district. And we want our churches to grow, to thrive in so many different ways. We've been given some great tools and things to think about today to do that. I think there's no greater time in the history of this world to be the church, because the church is deeper down more than ever. So we thank you all for being here. Some of you came a really long way, and I appreciate that. And we invite you back tomorrow from 3 to 5. Tomorrow we'll meet in the sanctuary. We won't meet up here. We'll meet downstairs in the sanctuary tomorrow. So come out tomorrow with the teams and pastors especially. We'll see you then. Let's close with prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the blessings of this day, for the instruction that you got. You've stirred our hearts and opened our eyes in so many ways, and we are grateful for the opportunities that you're going to send our way. May we be faithful to every single one of those, that we share and exemplify the presence of Christ in our lives. Be with those that are here and keep them safe as they travel home, Lord, and bless our churches tomorrow, and may we meet with great expectations for wonderful things to happen in your kingdom. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.